Hi, it's Jerningam here. We're going to put some more Brexit suspension and talk about Parliament getting closed. And I think it's a great idea that Boris is doing this. I like the idea of Boris, so well done, Boris, for doing this. It's thumbs up for me. I like the idea. What do you guys think? Suspending the Parliament is very interesting. I put the video on now.
The Brexit crisis is now entering uncharted waters, even for our flexible, unwritten constitution. It just took the Queen to give her consent, and it was done. Parliament will be prorogued or suspended for just over a month, from the second week in September until just a few days before Brexit. It's not unusual for Parliament to be suspended for a few days before a Queen's speech, when the government sets out its plans for new laws. What's different this time is the length and, of course, the questions around the motivation in the heart of a political crisis. Jacob Rees-Mogg, questioned by journalists after his meeting with the Queen, described it as a completely normal procedure. But is it? Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is here. Is it?
We were talking yesterday about how all those opposition parties were getting together, the opponents of no deal, to try to frustrate the idea of no deal using legislation. Today, what Number 10 did was effectively throw down one of those spike strips, the tyre shredders that people put down in front of that track. And as you say, they are using a long-standing convention. You suspend or prorogue Parliament when you're going to start a new session, but they are using it with specific intent. They intend to narrow the window for people they think intend to create mischief, and they think themselves are going to stretch the orthodoxies of our unwritten constitution, and probably will start doing it next week. So there is a battle on both sides now, nearly fully engaged. Next week, probably horribly, bloodily engaged. Who is currently the most destabilized by today? Well, some of the people who are planning to create mischief and frustrate no deal next week are saying this is concentrating minds wonderfully amongst, say, potential Tory rebels who they need to come over to their side and back their legislative attempts. But I'm also talking to people who've been lobbied by Number 10, and they're beginning to buy into the argument, oh, why don't we leave this to the other side of this long suspension? There is a little window there, the other side, where maybe then, if we're not happy with what things are looking like, maybe then we could pounce. The other side is saying, no, that's too late, don't touch that option. I think another sign that things have destabilised slightly on the, more than slightly, on the anti-no deal front, the fact that they moved to the legislative track yesterday en masse, all these parties, and today they started talking again about a vote of no confidence. The thing they were thinking probably wouldn't work. That tells you something. It also tells you that we could have a general election to add to the excitements of a day that unfolded in Aberdeenshire this morning. Into the serene calm of the Queen's Balmoral summer retreat,
really is rather dewy today, I think.
Enter a massive political storm. Jacob Rees-Mogg, along with the government chief whip, were dispatched by Number 10 to get the Queen to sign off on a new parliamentary session.
People may say this is an undemocratic move.
So they wouldn't know what they were talking about. It's normal functioning of our constitution. It was, he said, just a new government setting out its agenda, not how others saw it. Jeremy Corbyn and the Liberal Democrat leader Jo Swinson wrote to the Queen saying, don't do it. Their letters were too late. The order had been signed.
I'm sorry to catch you. Was it too happy to see you?
You'll just ask Her Majesty that. The Shadow Chancellor said this is a very British coup. It was sturgeon called Boris Johnson a tin pot dictator.
Critics will say this is an insult to democracy and denying the MPs the time they need to debate and possibly vote on Brexit.
Well, that is completely untrue. If you look at what we're doing, we're bringing forward a new legislative programme on crime, on hospitals, and making sure that we have the education funding that we need.
The Speaker, John Bercow, responded, it was blindingly obvious the intention was to stop Parliament debating Brexit and performing its duty in shaping a course for the country. Shutting down Parliament, he said, would be an offence against the democratic process. Here's the parliamentary calendar that opponents of no deal thought they were dealing with. The highlighted days show sitting days of the House of Commons. And next week, MPs who oppose no deal were hoping to force the government to cancel the break that happens for the conference season. adding even more sitting days to the tally they could play with, perhaps around 39 of them. The effect of today is to drastically reduce the number of sitting days of the House of Commons. If MPs who oppose no deal want to change the law in some way to stop no deal, they probably have just 5 days, starting next week, to start and finish that project.
I think it's looking very difficult. There are a number of steps that would need to be taken, and probably using an emergency debate to take time on the floor of the House, and then all the stages of the bills in both houses, remember. So getting through the Commons and the Lords looks very challenging.
He's shot their fox, probably.
It certainly looks like a good way to constrain the forces who are trying to prevent a no-deal exit.
There will be ample time on both sides of that crucial October the 17th summit, ample time in Parliament for MPs to debate the EU, to debate Brexit and all the other issues. Ample time.
The Labour leader didn't buy that and insisted he might yet try to bring the government down with a vote of no confidence.
But when Parliament does meet on his timetable very briefly next week, the first thing we'll do is attempt legislation to prevent what he's doing, and secondly, we'll challenge him on a motion of confidence at some point.
Wading in yet again, President Trump tweeted it would be hard for Jeremy Corbyn to seek a no-confidence vote against Boris Johnson, as Boris Johnson is exactly what the UK has been looking for and will prove to be a great one. Love UK.
We do, in Her Majesty's name, and in obedience to Her Majesty's this Parliament.
This is the last parliamentary ceremony proroguing or suspending Parliament ahead of the 2017 general election. It's a traditional device being used with highly political intent to gobble up parliamentary time. Proof of that, Tories lining up this summer to trash the idea, then floated by Dominic Raab.
I think it would be a terrible thing if, having said that we should have more power in this country and trust our institutions more, we did, as Don seems to be implying, and shut the doors on Parliament.
That goes against everything that those men who waded onto those beaches fought and died for. And I will not have it.
It is a ridiculous suggestion to consider proroguing Parliament.
You don't deliver on democracy by trashing democracy. You know, we're not selecting a dictator of our country.
I'm not attracted to archaic devices like proroguing.
Not attracted then, seduced now.
We need to get on with our domestic agenda, and that's why we're announcing a Queen's speech for October the 14th. Okay? Thank you.
A battle of political wills and wits is underway. The government's stretching of convention will next week be mirrored by their opponents in Parliament. The unwritten constitution creaking as politics polarises and anger intensifies.
Well, 3 politicians in a room with the Queen is all it took to suspend Parliament. Our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson, is at Balmoral, where it happened. Alex, tell us what happened.
Well, yes, and in many senses what the government, what Boris Johnson is saying, that this was a routine matter, is actually true, although of course the circumstances of how it was done are anything but routine. Two anti-Brexit protesters have come all the way from Newcastle upon Tyne to protest against this this morning. But what's been going on is really a very almost perfunctory affair. The Privy Council has to have 3 people to be quorate. Obviously, the leader would be Jacob Rees-Mogg as leader of the House and Lord President of the Privy Council. He would have gone in. It would have taken place in the library here at Balmoral, where the Queen conducts state business. She gets state papers most days except Mondays. They would have lit a candle, would you believe, to show that the meeting was in session. And then essentially, Jacob Rees-Mogg would have read out, one of the Privy Councillors would have read out the proclamation, effectively telling the Queen what to do. And the monarch would have said words to the effect of, I assent. One other little detail for you. These meetings are conducted standing up on the commendable and time-tested idea that if people stand up, they fall out of love with the sound of their own voices, and meetings happen very effectively. So perhaps we could all learn something from that.
Extraordinary circumstances. Did the Queen have any room for manoeuvre?
short answer to that, Jackie, a flat and definite no. There's nothing like our unwritten constitution for bending the meaning and abusing what verbs stand for. So we talk about these situations of the Queen being advised about the proroguing of Parliament or assenting to it. She has very little choice in the matter. The circumstance of this prorogation may be unusual, to put it politely, and highly political, and it's fair to say the Queen will not have seen one like this in her time on the throne. But it's also true that for the monarch to actually say no to this in any sense, it is simply unthinkable. People worry about our democracy, but at least is in a firmer sense of health than that.
Alex Thompson, thanks very much. Well, now, in the last hour, it's emerged that the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party will resign her post tomorrow. Ruth Davidson famously locked horns with Boris Johnson during the referendum and had opposed no deal. She was also against any move to suspend Parliament. Well, our Scotland correspondent Kieran Jenkins is in Edinburgh. Kieran, we'll hear from you later about other reaction in Scotland. But first, what can you tell us about Ruth Davidson?
Well, nobody really saw this one coming. Up until very recently, she was still saying she wanted to be First Minister of Scotland. A source very close to her tonight, though, denying reports that she's about to resign as the leader of the Scottish Conservatives after 8 years. We're told she'll make her position clear, probably. The reasons for quitting, for stepping aside. Of course, she returned to work just a few months ago after becoming a mum and taking maternity leave. There was no prospect of her talking to any media today. They were refusing all requests for interviews. But she has previously said, as you say, she would not support a no-deal Brexit. And as you say, there was no secret that she didn't see eye to eye with Boris Johnson. They clashed on the debate stage during the EU referendum. And this was how she greeted, remember, his exit from the 2016 Tory leadership contest.
I don't know. Leadership's not for everyone. Some people just haven't got it. Maybe he's one of them.
Well, Ruth Davidson, she took the Scottish Tories into second place here in Holyrood and made gains in Westminster. That, she thought, gave her leverage. And whatever the reasons that emerged for her resignation, Boris Johnson and her were not best of friends. We don't know if it was political, if it was personal. We do know that she has become the face of the opposition to independence and Scotland. And if she does go, and Boris Johnson too will have lost a very formidable opponent.
Thanks, Kieran. Now, we did, of course, ask the government to put up a minute to discuss today's suspension of Parliament, but Downing Street told us that they wanted Boris Johnson's brief clips shared by all broadcasters to speak for themselves. The leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, gave a similar television clip where he also wasn't asked a series of in-depth questions. But Labour did put up a senior minister, the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell. I began by asking him if the suspension of Parliament was indeed a coup.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is. When you have a Prime Minister...
What kind of coup?
It's one in which you're trying to prevent the operation of the normal democratic institutions. So I think that you would describe that as a coup, where the Prime Minister substitutes himself for the parliamentary process. They know what they're doing. Look, we knew this was coming. We've been contemplating it all through the summer and looking at what actions we can take.
But they've left you just enough time, haven't they, in those 4 or 5, those days that are left, to start the kind of legislation that you might want to start to prevent a no-deal Brexit.
Could be. It's incredibly tight, though, and it doesn't take much to get a bit of a filibuster in the House of Lords to prevent this sort of thing. I think what they're trying to do is most probably prevent us preventing a no-deal by shortening the parliamentary timetable and then blaming us for that. And then maybe saying, well, we'll now have a general election, it'll be people versus Parliament. But people see through that.
You're going to fall into that trap?
Not at all. What we'll try and do next week is be straight with people. We're opposed to no deal. There was a majority opposed to no deal last time we had a vote on this matter. We'll try and get legislation through that will prevent that happening. But if there is then a general election, we'll be honest with people. Explain what no deal consequences are, and that's why we try to prevent it.
But if you manage to pass legislation to prevent a no deal Brexit, and he then asks for a general election, triggers a general election, you'd be obliged to go along with that, wouldn't you?
We'll see how he poses that general election, because there's a whole range of options open to us then. The whole parliamentary process now has been opened up by Boris Johnson's intervention, which is trying to prevent democracy. And interestingly, on all sides of the House now, we're saying we're not going to have that. We will assert democratic rights of individual MPs.
So what exactly is the legislative path open to you now for preventing a no-deal Brexit?
Okay. There are a cross-party group that are now drafting up a legislative proposal which will have a range of options in it, as far as I'm aware. Now, they'll then publish that proposal, and it will be around making sure that we're not in a situation where a no deal is forced upon us without parliamentary decision.
But you need to take control of the parliamentary timetable.
It does do that, as we did before, if you remember, when there was a previous vote like this.
If it did come to a general election, would you only agree to one if an extension of the Brexit deadline was a precondition?
That'll be part of the debate that we have to have within Parliament itself. Do you know, by doing this, as I say, what Boris Johnson has done, he's actually re-excited MPs to say we want a democratic Parliament.
But if you had a general election before the Brexit deadline, the Prime Minister is in a much stronger position to unite the Brexit camp against the divided Remain.
Well, I think, you see, even the Brexit camp now is quite split, because most of them,
Really?
I don't think they want no deal. They didn't, when they were campaigning the referendum, they weren't
But they'd
campaigning
rather
for
have
no
a Brexit than not a Brexit, and if that's the
I
choice for
think calmer minds are coming to this matter now. The number of Conservative MPs in particular who may have voted for Brexit issues in the past in line with party policy, I think they're now saying, well, actually, we now know the consequences of a no-deal Brexit in particular, and we now know we've got a Prime Minister who'll go to the extremes of overriding Parliament to achieve that.
You are 12 points behind in the opinion polls. And this is an open goal
Well, let's see
for the Labour Party, and you're not scoring.
Well, let's have a look at the trends in those polls, because we were either neck and neck with the Tories or just ahead in recent polls. Boris Johnson comes along. You'd expect a Prime Minister to get a new Prime Minister to get a huge bounce. He didn't. He got less of a bounce than Theresa May.
But isn't the truth this, John McDonald, that the Remain side, especially your party, is very divided, and the Brexit side is divided between the Brexit party and the Tory party, and those divisions are being negotiated away every single day?
Well, isn't it interesting? Jeremy Corbyn convened a meeting yesterday of all the opposition parties, and he united the opposition to this government around opposition to
This
no
is after
deal.
weeks of opposition about whether he should be caretaker Prime Minister.
It needed that discussion to take place, and he did it.
He's united the opposition around the fact that he shouldn't be Prime Minister.
No, he's united the opposition yesterday about finding a parliamentary mechanism to block a no deal. We've got a joint endeavour now. What's interesting, it then split the Conservative Party.
Final question. You're not known as one of the most devout monarchists in the country. Do you have any sympathy for the Queen?
Yes, I do. Look, I've always had a lot of respect for the Queen. I've always expressed that. I'm not a monarchist, I'm a Republican. The issue is, as the Constitution now stands, she has to abide by what the Prime Minister brings to her. Now, it's the Prime Minister that's put her in this impossible position, so I do feel for her, and he shouldn't have done that.
So are you a Republican that's asking a monarch to overstep their constitutional powers?
No, I'm a Republican saying to a Prime Minister, just behave like a Prime Minister and not in this, reckless and irresponsible way.
John McDonald, thanks very much.
Thanks.
Well, with me now is resident historian of the Institute of Government, Dr. Catherine Haddon, and expert on parliamentary protocol, and John Curtis, who's Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde and a leading analyst of public opinion, talking to us from Glasgow. Let's talk to you, Catherine, first. Thanks for coming, by the way. Is it a coup, or is it just a massaging of the diary?
I think it's somewhere between the two of those. That this is constitutionally, the Prime Minister is able to do this. And the Queen could not, in these circumstances, refuse him.
And it's not unprecedented.
It's not unprecedented either. Of course, we have this every end of a parliamentary session to have prorogation, but also using prorogation in this way, that's certainly happened before. Politically, though, it's a very risky move and a very bold move in terms of the opposition that the government has now united together because of doing this. So
do you think
it may have backfired from them.
And do you think the boldness of the government's move here is proportional to the thinness of their majority?
That's difficult to judge. I mean, clearly you have a government now that is more willing to take these riskier manoeuvres. There's been a lot of talk over the whole of the summer about what they might try and do and the different manoeuvres that they're doing. There's still more talk today about even bolder things that they might do, calling multiple bank holidays to try and get through the time between now and October the 31st. So I don't think this will be the last of those sort of risky, bold manoeuvres that the government
So what
takes.
are the various options at the opposition's disposal now?
Well, what we're all looking for is what happens next week when Parliament returns, and we think most likely is they'll try to bring some kind of legislation. First of all, try and get control of the parliamentary agenda, and then try to bring some kind of legislation. And given the mood of the Speaker today, I suspect that he will be very much on side of those MPs who are trying to take control again in the way that they did in the spring.
Let's turn to John Curtis in Glasgow. John Curtis, do you think this might be a trap for the opposition? In other words, you pass no-deal legislation trying to get rid of no-deal Brexit, and then we can use that as an electoral ploy against you in a forthcoming general election.
Well, that is an electoral ploy, so long as the opposition are willing to play along with it. We should remember that under the terms of the Fixed Terms Parliament Act, it requires the votes of 2/3 of MPs to vote in favour of election, and if indeed the response of the government to a successful attempt by those in the anti-no deal camp to legislate away that possibility, they could say, well, I'm terribly sorry, Prime Minister, we don't agree there should be an election this side of the 31st of October. And in those circumstances, well, shall we say it's going to be very difficult for the government to call election. You would have to get rid of the Fixed Term Parliament Act first.
Now, when they engage in this extraordinary political gamble, the government must have been looking at some numbers somewhere. Are there numbers out there that are telling them that a risky gamble like this can actually pay off?
Well, in effect, what Boris Johnson is trying to do electorally is to unite the Leave camp, which is around half of the public, and is hoping that the Remain camp, which has been seriously divided in the wake of European Parliament elections between Labour and Lord Democrats and the SNP north of the border, that Remain voters remain divided. So far, he's had some success. Basically, since the end of May, support for the Brexit party has gone down by around 5 or 6 points. Support for the Tories has gone up by 5 or 6 points. And essentially, what one has to remember is that those people who voted for the Brexit party are indeed the one section of our electorate who are overwhelmingly in favour of leaving without a deal. And that's the group he's hoping to win over. And certainly insofar as you're suggesting there's a trap, yes, the risk the Remain side face is that if they do precipitate a general election, that Mr Johnson will be able to unite the Leave vote and the Remain vote remains divided. But that said, remember what Nigel Farage said yesterday. The condition for the Brexit party to be willing to, as it were, not stand and not compete against Mr Johnson is that he leaves without a deal. Now, at the moment, that's not the government's position. One of the other things that I think we discovered today is that insofar as the Prime Minister is still minded to try and get a deal, he now sees the Council in mid-October as a suitable date. Quite a few of those Brexiteers who are applauding his manoeuvre today are also still saying that getting rid of the Northern Ireland backstop would not be enough for us to vote for Mr Johnson's deal.
Okay, Catherine, to you. I mean, are we setting ourselves up for what we said at the beginning of the programme might be a major constitutional crisis? Parliament against the government, with the people and the referendum being used as the kind of key bargaining chip.
I think we're already into that situation of Parliament versus the executive, definitely. Whether or not this blows up into a full-blown constitutional crisis, I mean, that's the point at which things start to break down in terms of the
But we're not there yet.
work. We're not yet there. We're in a political crisis, we're in a national crisis, but we've been in one for some months.
Catherine Haddon, John Curtis, thank you very much to both of you. So does all this talk of prorogation and constitutional crisis mean that anything outside Parliament? So far, more than 500,000 people have signed an online petition demanding a halt to moves to suspend Parliament, while at least a dozen protests have been organised up and down the country, from Edinburgh in the north to Brighton in the south. Our Home Affairs correspondent Darsha Soni has been talking to voters in Dudley North, one of the most marginal seats in the country.
We're not going to wait until October the 31st before getting on with our plans to take this country forward. And that's why we are going to have a Queen's speech, and we're going to do it on October the 14th.
Wednesday is the most popular market day here in Dudley. Marlene Whittingham and Barry Thompson had just finished their weekly ballroom dancing session when they heard news of Boris Johnson's announcement.
You support what Boris Johnson is doing?
Yes.
They're talking today about him possibly suspending Parliament, though. Are you worried about that?
No, because he's going to do that to stop Mr Corbyn vote no confidence. So he wants to stop him coming out there to deal. Well, come out, whatever.
It'll be interesting what the Queen says, anyway.
The Friends like shopping here, but admit it's seen better days. This is a town that has suffered the decline of industry, of the steelworks and the foundries.
The town centre, it just declines. You've got a lot of shops closed, and you get more shops open, like what I call nifty shops like Acorn and the Heart Foundation.
Charity shops.
Charity shops.
Adrian Collins is a pub manager. However controversial today's announcement from Westminster, Mr Collins doesn't think it will make any difference.
I voted to leave the UK. And it's been so dragged out now. I don't care if we do or if we don't.
You've had enough of the whole thing.
I've had enough of the whole bunch of lies from both sides.
Mr Collins now feels that no mainstream party represents him, like many in this town where 70% voted to leave.
However controversial Boris Johnson's decision, the Tories hope that it will appeal to voters in areas like Dudley North, which they'll be targeting in the next election. This area has previously always voted Labour, but in the last election their majority was reduced to just 22 after widespread disillusionment over Brexit.
Kevin Moore's family have run a stall here for 80 years.
So all this talk today about what's going in Parliament, do you feel it affects your life, or do you feel it's kind of removed down in London?
No, it's all London-based, isn't it? It's like a different country down there. They treat us all different.
And it's that feeling that the goings-on at Westminster are far removed from people's everyday lives that won't change here, whether Parliament is suspended or not. Darshana Soni, Channel 4 News, Dudley.
Well, with me now are the Conservative former Cabinet Minister Sir John Redwood and the Liberal Democrat MP Layla Moran. Thanks to both of you for coming here. Let me start with you, John Redwood. Boris Johnson has a majority of 1. He was elected by a majority of 140,000 members of the Tory party. He has no mandate from the electorate, and yet he has done this. Outrageous.
Well, we have the biggest democratic mandate ever of the 17.4 million people who voted for the referendum and wished to see it implemented.
That was not a mandate to suspend Parliament.
And Boris and I and many other MPs were elected in that general election in 2017, and we're still covered by that manifesto and that mandate. And if this Parliament really doesn't want this government, then it has to table and win the relevant votes to get a general election. I don't think they're about to do that.
But we are a parliamentary democracy. That building over there has a task, and that's to keep an eye on the executive.
Yes, indeed, and it's doing it.
You're suspending them for 5
and
weeks
it's
at
extremely
a crucial
noisy
time of our history.
Well, I don't see it like that. We're following precedent. We always have 3 weeks off for the party conferences, and then we usually have a short gap at the end of each parliamentary year. Now, the previous government decided to go on for the biggest ever long session. It is high time we had a new Queen's speech and a full debate about the direction of the government with a new Prime Minister. I'm looking forward to that Queen's speech, and I would recommend opposition MPs join in that debate.
And later on, if you don't like what they're doing, you can just, vote against the government. Have a vote of their confidence.
If they allowed us, you know what? I want.
You can have a vote of their confidence next week on the 3rd of September.
I think it's utterly ridiculous that at a time of crisis, if you were in any other job and your organisation was going through a crisis, let alone the country, us as parliamentarians should be able to do our job. You're absolutely right. 5 weeks. Parliament has never been prorogued for 5 weeks before. And actually, I would argue, why on earth would we have a conference recess?
But hang on a minute, we have the conference season anyway.
Well, we shouldn't.
Right, okay. But we have the conference season anyway. I mean, you've got 4 fewer days to do the business that you want to do than you would have done without this. Surely, if you get your act together, you can do the things you want to do.
Well, that is already happening. And if there is anything that this has achieved, it has certainly concentrated the minds. We have now decided, once and for all, we are going the legislative route. We are going to, when we come back, there is a host of different ways we can do this. And critically, there is a speaker who has said that he will help Parliament be sovereign. We have a parliamentary democracy. Parliament must remain sovereign.
We know about the options. We've talked about the options to the last previous guests. What are you going to do? Which one do you personally prefer?
Well, I'm not in charge,
It's time
first of
to
all.
choose.
But second of
Tick-tock,
all,
tick-tock.
absolutely, and the best minds in Parliament and across the country in terms of legislation are looking at this now. I will back whichever one is going to stop no deal. But the point is, Boris Johnson is basically a coward. He doesn't want to face us parliamentarians. He is stopping the people through their representatives for having their voice, and this must be stopped, and it will be stopped.
And if Prime Minister Jeremy Corbyn can stop a no deal, are you okay with that?
Everyone is pulling together to make sure that no deal will not happen.
John Redwood, the majority of people in this country do not want a no-deal Brexit. Is it fair to enforce this, to shove this down their throats at this, very delicate stage?
The majority of people in Britain want this over.
But
They
lots of them
believe,
don't want a
they
no-deal
believe we
Brexit.
should implement the decision of the British people. Many people would have liked a good deal. Mrs May always said it was either good deal or no deal. She wouldn't accept bad deal. Her deal was a dreadful deal. The public and Parliament said it was a dreadful deal, so we must get on and leave.
What makes you think that after the 31st of October, if we leave without a deal, that suddenly things are going to be hunky-dory with the EU? We still need to fashion a future relationship with them.
Well,
We're
and we
storing
will.
up an awful lot of bad blood for the
And we
next
will be
stage.
doing an enormous amount of trade with them once we've left, because the World Trade Organization governs all that. We will be cutting the tariffs on imports, and we will, of course, have access to their market, just as America and China has access to their
This has
market.
been absolutely debunked. But the point, people are scared. A no-deal Brexit has real consequences, particularly for the most vulnerable. We're talking about food shortages,
No, we're not.
medicine
This is
shortages.
completely
This
wrong.
is the government that has said this. The same government that is proroguing us, and we can't scrutinise
There
that.
will be plenty of food
We
imported
need to
and
make
plenty of
sure
domestic
that
food.
we protect people, and the people who are meant to do that
Yeah.
are us parliamentarians, and we are being shut up by this government. It's unacceptable.
If I may, this could also be aimed at Brussels, could it not? Because Brussels has always thought that there's some wiggle room with Parliament that could get no deal, make no deal go away. If they're now told actually Parliament can't do it, then they might be forced to compromise on their own position on this. You don't believe it? Is that the way this government is playing it?
Well, I'm sure the government
Using
will hope-
Parliament as a pawn
No,
in its
it's not
negotiations
using
with
Parliament
Brussels.
as a pawn, but the government is very strongly saying to the EU that you could improve on a no-deal Brexit, and why don't they now make actions to do so? Because they've served up a dreadful withdrawal agreement which doesn't get us out, which takes our money and doesn't allow us to be an independent country. They either improve on that or we just leave.
Okay, John Redwood, Lena Moran, got to leave it there. Thank you very much. Let's go to Jackie at number 10. Jackie.
Well, welcome back to Downing Street. There's no noise at all from number 10, but at the gates of Downing Street, there have been hundreds of protesters gathered for the last 3/4 of an hour, singing to the tune of Oh, Jeremy Corbyn. They seem to be singing Get Rid of Boris. They've been there now for about 3/4 of an hour, no sign of them going home. Well, back to Scotland now, where First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has described this as a dark day for democracy, saying Boris Johnson was acting more like a dictator than a Prime Minister. Our Scotland correspondent Kieran Jenkins spoke to her earlier, and he also caught up with the Scottish Secretary, Alistair Jack. Kieran joins me now from Edinburgh. Kieran, what did they tell you? What can you tell us?
I was surprised at breaking news, first of all, that Ruth Davidson's closest aide say she is set to resign as Ruth Davidson's closest aide is not denying she is set to resign as Scottish Conservative leader. And one reason, of course, that she's been unhappy was the sacking of her ally, David Mundell, as Scottish Secretary. And right on cue today, his replacement popped up in Edinburgh, very much on message with Boris Johnson in terms of the reasons put forward for suspending Parliament. The Speaker of the House of Commons says that this is a constitutional outrage. Do you agree with him?
Absolutely not. We're giving plenty of time to debate it. We need to have a Queen's speech. We have a new Prime Minister. He needs a new legislative programme.
Why is
Thank
he
you
wrong?
very
He's
much.
the arbiter of our democracy. That's not an answer to the question. I'm afraid. That's not an answer to our question, Mr. Jackson. Plenty of time. Well, the Scottish Secretary wasn't hanging around to define that. But as for MPs' hopes of blocking no deal in Parliament, Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon told us she wasn't convinced there was now time to pass the necessary legislation. What she wasn't doing today was using this moment to suggest a different route to independence. But we do now appear to be in a more treacherous phase in terms of relations between Holyrood and Westminster. And I asked Scotland's First Minister, if she took Boris Johnson at his word that suspending Parliament was not about scuppering moves to stop no deal?
Yeah, let's be blunt and frank about this. Closing down Parliament in order to force through a no-deal Brexit that everybody knows is going to do deep and lasting damage to people the length and breadth of the UK is not democracy, it's dictatorship. And if the House of Commons doesn't come together next week to stop Boris Johnson in his tracks, then today will go down in history as the day any semblance of UK parliamentary democracy dies.
I can tell you that opponents of no deal aren't waiting around either. Here in Edinburgh, there's already a court case set for next week that has the support of 70 cross-party MPs. That was to try and use the Scottish court to prevent Boris Johnson from suspending Parliament. Now it's become a case to try and get him to unsuspend Parliament. I'm joined here by Joanna Cherry QC as the lead petitioner in that case. We'll talk about that in a minute. But first of all, Ruth Davidson, Scottish Conservative leader, looks like she's set to resign, and you lose perhaps one of your most formidable opponents to Scottish independence.
Well, I do rather wonder now who will lead the campaign against independence in the coming referendum. But what I would say about Ruth Davidson's impending resignation is that if Ruth is not prepared to tolerate government by Boris Johnson, then why should the people of Scotland tolerate government by Boris Johnson? The thing you need to understand about Ruth Davidson, she's in a very difficult position because she's failed to represent the views of Scotland, which voted 62% to remain. She's failed to represent the views of her constituents in Edinburgh Central, and I represent part of Edinburgh Central and Edinburgh South West. 75% Remain vote in Edinburgh. And I can tell you from the reaction I've been getting on the streets of Edinburgh today and in my email inbox, people in Edinburgh are very angry about this prorogation, and people in Edinburgh who would not have contemplated voting for independence 5 years ago now want an independence referendum and want to vote for independence.
We don't know her reasons for stepping down, but it does make your job a bit easier, doesn't it, if she's not around to oppose independence, certainly not in the capacity that she was before?
Well, I don't think it was a one-woman job opposing independence. Ruth Davidson certainly is a politician with formidable qualities.
She cut the number of seats you would have won here otherwise.
Well, which is a way...
And she took rather a lot of seats away from the SNP at the last general election.
First of all, she replaced the Labour Party as the official opposition here. The SNP still have more than twice as many seats as her here, and we're only 1 or 2 seats short of a majority here. And of course, there's a by-election in Shetland tomorrow where it looks like there might be a major upset. Insofar as Westminster is concerned, she did win seats back off us, but we still have more seats than all the other parties put together.
We're running out of time, so let me just ask you about your court case. You think you can unsuspend Parliament through the Scottish
hasn't
court?
been suspended yet. That's planned for the week after next. But we've already got a court action before the courts that was due to be heard next Friday. We've filed today for an urgent motion to get the court to hear the case tomorrow or Friday to suspend the effect of today's decision.
You're reacting to events here, aren't you? Do you think that basically you've been outmanoeuvred?
Well, I don't think we've been outmanoeuvred. I think the British government have been disingenuous. Part of their defence to our action when we filed it a month ago was that the question was academic. So they've been disingenuous. Okay. I'm confident we've got reasonable prospects of success tomorrow or Friday.
Huh. Interesting. I don't think they're going to get through though.
Chris, the good news if you're a British tourist in Paris.
Anyway, guys, I hope you've all enjoyed the let's see. Before we end the video, just thinking at the minute. Try and find some more videos.
Five years ago, I left the Conservative Party. Like many people, I'd come to believe that the Conservative Party had fundamentally lost its way on Europe. For years, it seemed to me, the party had been run...
Nah, don't want to... Let's see. Just thinking, guys.
I'm not responsible for what other people might be talking about. I don't plant stories in the newspapers. That is a black art, perhaps, practiced by other people from time to time. It's not something that greatly concerns me. I don't get very excited about it. The honourable gentleman is entirely entitled to seek the assurance of equality of treatment. Let me just say one further thing in the light of some press reports. people really ought to understand, because it's incredibly simple, straightforward and uncontroversial. Any honourable or right honourable member of this House who wishes to come to see the Speaker about something that concerns him or her can ask to do so. And diary permitting and subject to agreement on suitable dates, that would always happen. The notion that some particular advantage is given to a specified individual or a little coterie as part of a secret plot in private apartments is so staggeringly absurd that I wouldn't expect for one moment that someone of the intelligence and perspicacity of the honourable gentleman would give it credence for so much as a single second. I hope that's helpful to the honourable gentleman. If there are no further points of order, sorry. So, point of order, Matt Warman, we're grateful to the honourable gentleman.
I did mention in the earlier statement that the Sunday Times was in my constituency taking its temperature. And I should say that my constituents did raise your role as well as the role of the government. And so I would perhaps say gently in response to your earlier comment that there is some doubt out there amongst the public. And the question they asked me to ask you was, you changed some precedents last week. Some of them wanted to know if you expected to change any more.
Already indicated. I made a judgment last week. I look at issues on a case-by-case basis, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. I know the honourable gentleman will understand if I say that as someone who's been the guardian of the rights of this House for the last 9.5 years, I am confident and comfortable that others recognise my commitment to fairness in this chamber. I have a high regard for the parliamentary commitment of the honourable gentleman. I have no intention, and I don't refer to the honourable gentleman in this context, I have no intention of taking lectures on doing right by Parliament from people who have been conspicuous in denial of and sometimes contempt for it. I will stand up for the rights of the House of Commons, and I will not be pushed around by agents of the executive branch. They can be as rude as they like, they can be as intimidating as they like, they can spread as much misinformation as they like. It won't make the slightest bit of difference to my continuing and absolute determination to serve the House of Commons. And unlike some people in important positions who of course are elected constituency members but have not been elected to their offices here, I have been elected, re-elected, re-elected and re-elected as Speaker to do the right thing by the House of Commons. That's what I have done, that's what I am doing, and that's what I will go on doing. That is so crystal clear that I feel sure it will satisfy the honourable gentleman.
Interesting. Right, what else can we look for in here? Well, I hope you've all enjoyed this video, guys. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share these videos with your friends. And tell me what you guys think about Parliament. Should we stay in the EU or leave? I reckon we should leave, and Boris Johnson's basically gonna get us out, hopefully. If he does, it'd be good. It'd be great. Boris Johnson is stopping Parliament. I'll try and find the title. Before I go, these are the people that are trying to stop Boris Johnson and go for Jeremy Corbyn. Which I don't agree with Jeremy Corbyn. So all these people here are moaning about Boris Johnson.
We're here because our democracy wasn't given to us as an act of generosity and charity
by the people at the top. It was the one for the struggle and sacrifice of our ancestors, and it's not for an unelected Prime Minister to shut down the elected Parliament to ram through a no deal for which he has no democratic mandate.
Manchester.
Johnson! What do we want? Stop the coup! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Stop the coup! When do we want it? Now! Stop the coup!
Bristol. Everyone's doing it. Birmingham.
Stop the coup! 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 Boris Johnson's got to go! Stop Brexit!
Edinburgh, Scotland.
Stop Brexit! Stop the coup! Stop Brexit!
Cardiff, Wales. Yeah. Craziness, man.
Power is shifting from Parliament. Tonight, the power is shifting from Parliament to Prime Minister. No need to defeat MPs, and he can just dismiss them, suspending their work, allegedly, so he can get on with his own and announce a plan for government.
We're bringing forward a new legislative programme on crime, on hospitals, and making sure that we have the education funding that we need. And there will be ample time on both sides of that crucial October the 17th summit. Ample time in Parliament for MPs to debate the EU, to debate Brexit, and all the other issues. Ample time.
But today, that time was officially cut short by the Queen, who issued the order to prorogue Parliament from here in Balmoral. 3 members of the government flying up to deliver Her Majesty's directions, refuting the claims of a coup.
So they wouldn't know what they were talking about. It's normal functioning of our constitution.
But as for the functioning of Parliament, well, MPs return there on Tuesday before it's quickly suspended sometime the next week. That means instead of returning after party conferences on the 7th of October, they won't be back until there's a Queen's speech on the 14th, just days ahead of a vital EU summit and leaving virtually no time to block leaving without a deal on Halloween.
What the Prime Minister's doing is a sort of smash and grab on our democracy in order to force through a no-deal exit from the European Union. What's he so afraid of that he needs to suspend Parliament to prevent Parliament discussing these matters?
It's dictatorship. And if MPs don't find a way of coming together next week to stop Boris Johnson in his tracks, then today will go down in history as the day any semblance of UK democracy died.
The Speaker, John Bercow, added, however it's dressed up, it is blindingly obvious that the purpose of prorogation now would be to stop Parliament debating Brexit and performing its duty in shaping a course for the country. Shutting down Parliament would be an offence against the democratic process, suggesting he'll help MPs act quickly. And tonight, this senior Conservative already has. Ruth Davidson is expected to resign as Scottish leader tomorrow, as others in her party urge action.
A number of my colleagues would have preferred to wait and move in late September. That will now not be possible. We will have to try to do something when Parliament returns next week.
Stop the coup!
The protests, though, don't come from all quarters. Others are happy to vacate their benches, insisting it's nothing unusual.
People will say, you campaigned to bring democracy back to Parliament, and now you're in favour of closing Parliament down.
That is yeah, but you could say that, but it's absolutely wrong. Parliament is not being closed down. The period is exactly how you would do it under any parliamentary period.
But tonight, the period we live in feels unlike any other. Protesters managing to break through the barriers outside Parliament, arguing it's the Prime Minister who's crossing the line.
Well, that's the way it is. People are sick of going around in a circle. We want to leave the EU. That's what we want. Most people want it, and some people don't, but that's what some people want.
Thank you very much for coming in. As I said on the steps of Downing Street, we're not going to wait until October the 31st before getting on with our plans to take this country forward. And this is a new government with a very exciting agenda to make our streets safer. It's very important that we bring violent crime down. We need to invest in our fantastic NHS. We need
Yeah, we just went before. Trying to find a different video. Unless I've covered all the videos on there we need to cover, guys. Well, I hope you all enjoyed the stream. Hope to see you in the next one. Thank you for joining this video. Tell your friends about this video if they're interested in politics and Boris Johnson. Yeah, thank you for joining me, and see you in the next one, guys. Peace.